Welcome to CG seminar number 209, and our topic today is intersectoral relationships within higher education, and that's in this case the relationship between further education and higher education in the UK, and we've got a research-based approach to that discussion today. I'm going to introduce you to our presenters, Michael Shattock and Stephen Hunt, in a minute. But first, let me take you through the webinar protocols, and you will have heard these before, perhaps. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website in due course. Usually it takes 24 hours or so. A transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted, and you'll be able to see the webinar in YouTube, which is the form in which it's posted. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar either, but please turn it on and your audio when you're asking a question. Now, we recommend you use speaker view in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking. We compose the Q&A by the questions you put in the chat. So if you're curious about something, if you'd like to interrogate the presentation, or you simply want to make a statement on the issues yourself, please type out your question or statement, and I'll be able to identify you from the chat and bring you into the Q&A. When you're invited to ask your question in the Q&A, you unmute, you switch on your video, and you state your name and where you are from. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce Michael Shaddock. He's perhaps the most influential and important scholar of higher education in England, and well known throughout the world in that function. He's written a number of major books on governance and management, including his 2019 Bloomsbury volume with Aniko Horvath, which was part arising from the Centre for Global Higher Education project research, which he's going to talk about today. Perhaps few people, I think, have a better sense of the sector and where it's going than Mike, and it's really valuable to have him on the show. Stephen Hunt, a valued research associate, colleague in the Centre for Global Higher Education, has been from the beginning. And he's was working on new private providers, and he's taken that knowledge and that work into work with Mike and Mike's project team, who are looking at governance. And Steve's been looking at this interface between further education and higher education, which you'll hear about today. So I'm going to hand over to Mike, and Mike will bring Steve in when Mike's finished, and then I'll come back in and supervise the Q&A. So don't forget, put your questions in early. You're more likely to get in the Q&A if you raise your question soon after the speakers have finished, or even before that. If you come in late with your question towards the end of the webinar, you might miss out. Pleasure now to hand over the screen to Mike.
Well, thank you, Simon. It's a great pleasure to be talking in the webinar. We're going to manage this session with three sections. The first is going to be an introductory session by me. Then we come to the meat of the session, which is the data gathering and our findings. And Steve will be doing the heavy lifting there. And then we will have some conclusions, which I'll come back to at the very end. Then I hope we'll get some interesting questions. So if I start, let me start with my introduction. If we think of higher education as a kind of tapestry of activities, our project, the FEHE interface project or study, would represent only a small square of its surface. But we think that our findings nevertheless uncover some significant policy issues. The position of post-secondary education vis-a-vis higher education can be an issue of considerable tension. in many national systems, whether they operate as separate sectors or whether with their own policy agendas, or whether they're brought together in a simple collaborative sector. The UK offers alternative approaches. Thus, Wales has opted for a tertiary education system, bringing post-secondary and higher education under one policy roof. And Scotland seems to be moving in the same direction. But England maintains a dual sector approach with separate policy drivers for each sector. And now it might be sensible if I said just a little bit about the further education sector. Further education colleges were actually once under local education authorities, but in 1993, they were incorporated and removed from LEAs, from LEA control, and given independent status. They look a bit like a community college in a North American setting, but on the other hand, they don't have quite the same status as a feeder institution to higher education as they do have in North America. Where they start in the education system is that they take in students age 16, but can take in students much older, of course, at 18 or 19. The students can do GCSEs at the colleges, but most of the college activity is in technological and professional qualifications. As a sector, however, they've taken very much a second place to higher education, both in respect of funding and, of course, in status. In November 2019, when our research began, the Association of Colleges, that's the overarching body that represents colleges, listed 294 colleges across the UK, distributed as follows. England, 248, clearly much the largest part of the system. Scotland, 26, Wales, 14, Northern Ireland, 6. However, we found that the main sources of data about the colleges, the Department for Education, that is the government, the Association of Colleges itself, and the Office for Students, didn't include material which enabled judgments to be made as to the interface that existed between FE and HE. Our research, therefore, has been to fill in the gap so as to be able to establish the nature of the interface and the extent to which it contributes, if at all, to the policy environment. Partway through the data gathering process, the UK government published two important policy documents, both bearing heavily on the FE sector in England. The first was the white paper, Skills for Jobs, Lifelong Learning for Opportunity and Growth. That was published in January this year. And the second was a policy paper entitled Build Back Better, Our Plan for Growth. And that was published in March this year. The white paper was chief aim was to prioritize investment in FE, and the policy paper was concerned to reverse the national industrial strategy developed by the previous government, but both described the FE sector as an independent entity within the education system and designated its prime function as being to provide the skills base to enable industry and commerce to flourish. This suggests a considerable narrowing of what is currently its function. The evidence from our study offers some corrective to these perspectives. And with that, I'll hand over to Steve to present our findings. Steve.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike. I'll just move. This is the structure that we're going to go through. Mike already mentioned that. So I'll be basically, we're at stage 2 now. I'll be talking about the data gathering and the findings of our research. We developed a survey instrument to capture 5 different types of formal arrangements between further education colleges and universities. And that's how we're going to be looking at this, the idea of the interface. So to go through these arrangements, either joint activities or direct partnerships, were firstly exclusive student progression arrangements between an FE college and a university. Secondly, multiple progression arrangements between single colleges and multiple universities. Thirdly, franchise teaching, where an FE college delivers a course proposed by a university. Fourthly, validation, whereby a university awards a degree for the content and delivery of the FE college's course. And finally, apprenticeship degrees, highly vocational, of course. These are relatively recent introductions and are likely to be limited to a few colleges that count as FE and HE colleges. In the research, we asked the name of the universities involved in each of the arrangements where they occurred, and the subjects included in these arrangements, along with the student numbers involved. And I'll be reporting on each of these aspects for the colleges throughout the UK. So this is the data, just a few words about the data gathering phase. The research took place in the latter half of 2020, and we emailed 301 email questionnaires to colleges, 255 in England, 26 in Scotland, 14 in Wales, and 6 in Northern Ireland. And that was basically all the colleges we could find operational. And in terms of response, a total of 130 FE colleges responded, which represents about now 45% of the active colleges in the sector. I say now, the sector is in an almost perpetual state of change as a series of mergers go on, seemingly unstoppably, and some of the colleges we had listed when we began didn't exist by the time we finished gathering our data. And in terms of our actual findings, we found that about 89% of FE colleges indicate they had some sort of joint arrangement or direct partnership with at least one higher education institute, at least one university. And only 10% indicate they had no formal links. Although I have to say that 9% we had missing data relating to those questions. We'll take a quick look at the responses by region. Here in figure 1, and they indicate that our survey included representation from every region and country in the UK, and many regions exceeding a 40% response rate in terms of the prevalence of FE colleges in those regions. Even lower responding regions, particularly London, have actually gave us quite a healthy return, and in fact the actual numbers responding to our questionnaire in London exceeded the entire FE presence in some other regions. The results from the UK-wide coverage indicated there were very few exclusive progression agreements. We can see from the first line in table 2. And that is much more common for FE colleges to engage in multiple progression arrangements. So we could see that from the second line in the table. There's also a similar pattern, or that won't be apparent from this, but there's a similar pattern in respect to franchising and validation arrangements, and these two tended towards the multiple. As expected, there were few FE colleges engaging in apprenticeship degrees, as you can see on the bottom row there. So although not all colleges were engaged in all the types of arrangements, almost all were engaged in at least one. On the HE side, 95 different universities, more than half of UK universities, were involved in the formal arrangements with FE colleges, with at least one formal arrangement with FE colleges. But there's a clear variation in the type of university involved. The oldest and most prestigious universities, which are captured in the first line by the Russell grouping, are the least likely to be involved, and the most likely are post-92 universities. These universities began in the 1970s as polytechnics that themselves were formed by amalgamations of existing local colleges into greater regional units, with a focus on more vocational education. These were all granted university status at the same time in 1992, hence the post-92 universities title. And these are the most enthusiastic collaborators with FE colleges. Now we'll take a look at the subjects involved in these joint arrangements. The FE disciplinary spread strongly supports the largely vocational character of the sector. STEM subjects comprise over a third of the activities. So engineering and technology, computer science, subjects allied to medicine, and physical and biological sciences. And if other vocational subjects are included, such as business and education, the figure rises to 65%. There are some special relationships between certain colleges and universities, particularly involving agriculture. So there'll be a long established interest in both the colleges and the universities in that particular subject. And also FE has a special role in creative arts, where colleges teach for diploma courses, which then influence students' decisions to seek out HE places in these fields. And it's also worth noting that the entire art and design system in the UK was folded into the polytechnics when they were created. So that might introduce a bias in terms of selecting the type of university to become involved with, particularly in that area, because fine art was basically missing from the university sector, and it had its own sector that then became incorporated universities through these post-92 universities. We'll have a quick look at the region and county variations in the arrangements. And there's considerable variation in the range of FE, HE activities across the region and countries. The two regions that had the greatest presence in our survey and a high presence of colleges, the north, west and south east of England, had the highest number of interface activities. But Scotland stands out as having twice as many progression arrangements between FE and HE as any other region. This reflects the long-standing position that 20% of Scottish HE is delivered in the FE sector, which is quite distinct from the rest of the UK, particularly England. One reflection of the importance of the FE-HE interface is, of course, the number of students. If they were low, it would indicate that although it existed, it was less significant. But our inquiry identified over 30,000 students engaged in these arrangements, with 2/3 of these involved in validation programs. As we can see, if we look at table 5, we look down validation, it's by far the largest area of student engagement. What's striking is the extent to which these arrangements have become integral to the colleges concerned. 5 colleges, for example, have over 400 students on franchise programs, and 16 have over 500 students studying programs validated by universities, and 4 with over 1,000 students. 2 of these in England, 1 in Scotland, and 1 in Wales. And now I've gone through the different aspects of our data gathering. I'm going to hand over back to Mike, who's going to make some concluding remarks.
Well, thank you, Steve. We think that these figures, particularly if you think of terms of 89% of colleges having formal links with higher education institutions, we think that these figures demonstrate a breadth and a depth of interface which simply is not being recognized at a national policy level. The data and the economic and geophysical context of Wales and Scotland, and probably Northern Ireland too, strongly support moves to tertiary education systems, where policies between higher and further education are closely integrated, and where institutions working in collaboration can make significant social and economic impacts. The position is less clear-cut in England, and that's because of the diversity of the economic and geophysical profiles of the different regions. I mean, if you compare London, for example, to the Northwest, you will see that there's a great difference between the regions. Nevertheless, our data, which shows a considerable interpenetration of the two sectors, suggests that steps ought to be taken to remove the silos in policy making between the two sectors at national level, and that individual regions in England should, if appropriate, and if their powers permit, be encouraged to move in a tertiary direction. We think that this would make a big contribution to the UK's levelling up agenda and give strategic impetus to building on the strengths of the two sectors. And I think if there's one simple conclusion to be obtained from the figures that Steve has outlined, is that if you transpose these 45% of the sector that returned to us to 100%, what you'd find is that the vast majority of colleges actually have formal links with higher education institutions, and policymakers should be taking account of that and treating parts of the components of the two sectors as coming together. I'll rest there and wait for some questions.
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Steve. That's very nicely done, very clear. Let me ask the first question. Where do we go from here in the UK? I mean, if you were a minister, what would be your strategy for building a more effective post-secondary sector? What steps would you take?
Well, what a nice thought. If I was the minister, I'd first of all have to divide myself between being the Scottish minister, the Welsh minister, or the Northern Irish minister. So let's just concentrate on being the minister for England. What I confess that I would like to see is a much greater decentralization, and indeed not just of higher education in England. I think what we can see, if you look at our evidence, and also if you look at the evidence that we're getting from the Universities and Regions project, that you will only really address the levelling up agenda if you do it on a regional basis. I mean, again, using the Universities and Regions evidence, we've come across universities in the west of England who have a string of 12 further education colleges connected to them and are in a way part of their system. If you go to the north of Scotland, you come to the University of the Highlands and Islands, which I had a hand in establishing. And there, the Highlands is something like 1/6 of the landmass of the UK, and all the colleges have come together to form a single university with FE funding and HE funding going into a central pot in the Central University Authority, and then going out to Perth or Skye or the Outer Hebrides and so forth. So I think that the centre has got to involve regions in these kinds of decisions, and that the policy issues that arise from taking students from deprived backgrounds and bringing them into higher education cannot be done at a central level. It has to be done at a regional level. So that would be my answer.
So the long process of moving away from local authorities as exercising a pivotal role in the sector, the long process of centralisation now needs to be reversed.
Well, it needs to be reversed in a modified way, because what we've got now is 9 metro mayors, for example, with so-called devolved regions. Now, the government appears to be hauling itself back from its previous commitment to full devolution. But devolution of higher education can be seen to work, because we've seen it work in both Scotland and in Wales. And if you think of the Northern Powerhouse, the population of the Northern Powerhouse is larger than you would find in Wales.
Mm.
So there's a level above local authority and between them and government, which ought to be the decision making for a large part of higher education.
And so London would constitute a region in that sense as well.
Yes.
Okay. Now, just to switch to the comparative dimension for a moment, which countries do you think handle the relationships between post-secondary sectors effectively, in your view? I mean, what configurations work? I'm not saying you can just transplant a good system from one country to another. We know that they're organic and they're rooted and they're path dependent to some extent. But in your observation, and you've done OECD reports in several countries, I mean, who does it well in your view?
Well, a country we've been looking at in the European part of our governance study is Norway. And there what you see is a sort of common view across all the main political parties that the hinterland has been underfunded and insufficiently developed in terms of higher education. So what you've got are large-scale mergers of colleges and a determined attempt for these colleges, these merged colleges, to become universities, but to be able to offer degree courses and non-degree courses from the same locations. And of course, using online education, you could run courses from College X for students in College Y without difficulty. So Norway is one, I think, pretty good example. On the other hand, a pretty bad example, and I don't know whether there are any Germans present, pretty bad example is Germany, where there is, as far as one can see, almost no contact between the university sector, which is very large, and the technical Fachhochschulen sector, which is much smaller. I mean, a ratio of 4 to 1. And there, the kind of work that the Fachhochschulen sector are doing, which is to some extent comparable to what goes on in FE, is quite divorced, as we see it, from the university sector. So it varies. But what you can see in the UK is a real example of this working in Wales. In Wales, after devolution to Wales, you had a situation where there were 13 universities which were voluntarily brought down to 8, and there were 26 FE colleges which were brought down, I suspect not so voluntarily, to the smaller number that we have now. And the planning of the sector is much more realistic in terms of FE colleges moving into higher education. And in a classic sense, in one university that we visited in Wales, you had a situation where 2 of the older universities in Wales had nursing programs, and all the students who came to the nursing programs came from England, and having got their degrees, they went back to England. But when this regional university, or neighborhood university, as you might call it, started up a nursing program, they attracted students from nearby highly deprived areas. And these students went straight in after graduation into the local hospitals. So the hospitals got their manpower, but not only that, but the students were actually ministering to people of their own kind from their own region, and probably speaking Welsh to them. So in other words, this is a clear case of the higher education system being moved much more closely into the community.
One more for me, and then we'll bring in Johnny. Rich will be ask our first question from the floor, if you like. My last question is about the politics. Mike, Steve, do you detect any appetite in Westminster for being serious about the relationship between FE and HE, really rethinking it, and also being serious about rethinking devolution and regional organisation in the way you're suggesting? Is there any appetite for it?
Well, I think, and let me answer before Steve comes in. I think what we're facing at the moment, and of course this is a good day to be raising this because it's the local elections, but at the moment, what it appears is that the government is not interested in any kind of connection between FE policy and HE policy. Mm. That would not be the case, however, in the Labour Party, which is certainly promising devolution, and as far as one can make out from policy pronouncements, is very interested in the FE-HE relationship, though they've not spelt out any particular policies. But I think we're looking at a sort of historic divide between Scotland and Wales and England, and it's going to take a very significant change of thinking, probably in both political parties, to get substantial change. I don't know whether Steve feels the same or not.
I'd just like to agree. I think that what we've seen is with the white paper that you referred to, Skills for Jobs, it was no indication of any integration or interface really between FE and HE, and it looks like you almost got 2 sectors in the way that you you describe them in Germany. At least that seems to be the plan. So I don't really see the possible future you mapped out, Mike, for integration is really is on the cards at the moment. That's the impression I get anyway from the white paper.
But if there was a change of government, Keir Starmer was Prime Minister, then it all could happen. That there's a possibility your thinking could come home, or there's something like it.
One thing that you can go on, Mike.
It might come about that way, or it might come about because some of the metro mayors start demanding a real stake in higher education and further education in their areas. So in other words, you might find it happening in West Yorkshire because there's a need for it in West Yorkshire. We don't know whether it will be a kind of cumulative, policy rolling from one part of the country to another, or whether it will be a big splash, as it were, from Westminster. It's hard to say at the moment.
But the politics of the four nations could well intervene here too, could well shape and influence the way devolution is handled within England as well.
Yes.
Yeah, that seems to be the sort of point of change, doesn't it? Because that's clearly unstable now.
Well, that was the main finding in a way of the book that Aniko and I did, which was the way Scotland and Wales had grasped the fact of devolution and had developed their own policies successfully.
Now, at this point, I'd like to open up the conversation to everyone and to invite Johnny Rich, who's had a couple of points to make already in the chat. Johnny.
Thanks, Simon. And thanks, Mike and Steve, for the presentations. I had a number of questions, really, but they're all interrelated. So forgive me for rambling a little bit. But I'm really interested to know what the data tells us about any comparative effectiveness of delivering level 4 and beyond education in FE, and do the student outcomes, are they comparable? I know there's the student body is not comparable in the two, in FE and HE, but if we can allow for that, control for that, can we work out whether or not completion rates are similar, whether or not employment rates are similar, whether or not earnings potential is similar, and so on. Also, do we know anything about the effectiveness of FE as preparation for HE, even if the HE is conducted in an HE institution? And finally, the Auger Review has proposed that we basically get rid of foundation courses, and that process should be done through access courses in FE colleges. And I was wondering if you had any reflections on whether or not that's a sensible proposal.
Well, that's a fair whack of questions, if I may say so, Johnny.
My apologies.
Let me just, you would be able to get data, I think, on the future earnings and so forth, and current earnings of students entering higher education through FE. I mean, we haven't done it, but I think that if you look at the data that there is in general on students, what you would see is that students who come from relatively deprived backgrounds, their salaries and so forth after graduation are lower than people who come from middle class backgrounds and go to Russell Group universities. So I think that's pretty clear. One of the things we found in the universities and regions study, though, is that, of course, one way of looking at having an FE-HE relationship is that it's a sign of weakness in terms of qualifications. And indeed, the table that Steve put up, showing that the post-92 universities, are massively the most involved in further education. So a traditional HE view would show that in a way as a sign of weakness. What we're going to argue, though, in the universities and regions work, is that actually it's also a sign of strength, because something like, well, I can't give you the figures offhand, but in many of these universities, 50 to 60% of the students come from the region and go back into the region. These regions are themselves, relatively speaking, and sometimes wholly deprived economically and socially. So what these institutions are doing is providing opportunities for people from relatively deprived backgrounds to come into higher education, get degrees, and then go back into their communities. And we have a classic example, again from Wales, where a university has taken in an FE college into itself as part of its authority, as it were. And the students come from the valleys to the FE college, and they then say, no, we're not going to transfer to the university, even though it's only 10 miles up the road, because that takes us too far away from our communities. So the university has actually moved certain courses down to the FE college so that students living at home can come and do their degree course in the FE college, which is close to home, and having got their degree, can go back into their former mining communities. Now, there are arguments for and against that, and they're easy to spot, but that's the importance of the relationship. Now, that relationship will change in different regions in the country. It'd be quite different in London, obviously, be quite different in the Southwest, etc., etc. Though again, in the University and Region study, there's a college in Devon, which is hugely higher education, simply because the students in Cornwall, don't want to go to universities in Plymouth because it's too far away. I mean, fantastic for somebody like me, but absolutely real on the ground. I hope that sort of answers your question. Oh, the last thing was access courses. And yes, I think access courses are really important. If you're taking in students who maybe left school at 16, and you're bringing them in to, as it were, courses in FE, then you need to take account of the fact that they've missed out on chunks of education, they're unused to writing essays, etc., etc., and access courses are critical. And for these people going on into higher education, they will simply not have, the classic A-level entry tariff. They'll come with something different. Okay.
Thanks, Johnny. Is that enough, do you think? Did you want to follow up any further?
Only to ask, I mean, I agree entirely about the importance of access courses. I was interested in any reflections you might have on access courses versus foundation courses. I mean, I don't believe it should be an either or, personally, but the Augur review clearly does.
Oh yes, I had forgotten the Augur review. I'm not sure I can answer that. I'm not an enthusiast for the Augur review from all sorts of points of view, and I'm not really an enthusiast for foundation degrees, if that's what you're referring to in terms of foundation courses. I think it should be possible for people to enter an FE college and do access courses and move upwards through a series of modules into doing degree work for which they may or may not transfer into universities.
At this point, I'd like to interrupt the conversation between Johnny and Mike and bring in some other players. Victorita, you've got the next question.
Hello, thank you, Simon. Congratulations, Michael and Stephen. What is the impact of fee on the students? Thank you.
Steve, can you answer that? I don't know what fees are at the FE level. They're nil, aren't they?
We didn't get any. We haven't got any data on that to report, so I can't really answer the question. And we certainly haven't got anything comparative, so we wouldn't be able to say what the distinction was between, FE and HE in that respect.
The position is that students entering FE are not charged tuition fees until they become part of the higher education system. So an FE college might charge, if it was doing the first 2 years of a degree program, if they were doing a franchise course, they could either charge £6,000 or the university could charge the student and give the FE college a share. And there might be a rather tense negotiation between the FE college and the university as to what the FE college's share is. And it's one of the reasons why FE colleges have been so anxious to get HE courses, because it's a way of bringing fee income into the college.
That's pretty good going for a question which was unanswerable. Thanks, Mike. Hongwei, you're next. Hongwei Gu.
Thank you for this thoughtful talk. Given that the interfaces between FE and HE are configured in different ways, how can internal progression be enhanced? Thank you.
Let me think that through for just a moment. I think the answer is, and I'm looking a bit at Steve in case he has a completely different point of view on this, but I think that what FE colleges do is they set up programs which, you take seriatim. In other words, if you enter and do an access course, you could then step into a lower level course, which then takes you through into a higher level course. I mean, one of the interesting things that we found was that Steve referred to the arts courses, the creative arts courses. And there, one of the functions of these courses in FE is to persuade students that they may or they may not be interested in taking creative arts to a degree level. And so the colleges have created a diploma program, and in a way you could see it as a kind of taster for the student. I mean, you know, am I somebody who is really interested in design or in painting or in whatever? And that's a guide to whether you apply for a creative arts program in a university. But the strength of FE really is its flexibility. Every FE college has its own market, so it plays its courses according to the market, and it can change them if the market dries up. It's not a hard and fast system. And that actually has been one of the strengths of the incorporation of colleges, taking them away from local education authorities and making them, as it were, compete with one another in a marketplace. I don't think I've answered your question very well, but it's the best I can do. I don't know whether Steve can add to it.
No, that seems a pretty fair response, really.
Yep,
Fair answer.
I thought so. Now, I've got a question from John Anker. John Anker has unfortunately had to leave the webinar, but he's asked me to ask his question for him. And I fear it will take us partly back into the terrain of fees and what all that means. And I think we'll be depending on the scraps of knowledge you've picked up during your research here. Question is, what level of fees are charged for HE in FE programs? Remembering that, you know, the HE fee rate over in universities. What level of fees are charged for HE in FE programs? What might be the implications of the Auger report on this? And are there international students on these programs? And if so, what level of fees do they pay?
Well, once again, there isn't a clear answer, but let me go over the points that I made previously again. A large number of the HE students in FE will be on so-called franchised courses. These franchise courses have been deliberately arranged with a university, and there may be alternative ways of charging fees. In other words, the university might charge the student doing the franchise degree course the full whack of fees that would be charged if you were doing a BSc degree in the university, as it were, like a normal student. And it may give the college a chunk of that fee, and that would be a matter of negotiation between the college and the university. On the other hand, in some other programs, like foundation degrees, which can be done entirely within a college, then the college will itself be charging a fee, and probably they'll be charging at the kind of minimum level of £6,000. The last part of the question was, what happens in regard to international students? Once again, and you need to look at institutions. I mean, most FE colleges only have a very modest number of international students. But there are some parts of the country, Birmingham area is one, East London is another, where the immigrant community have maintained their links back home. And so there are significant numbers of international students. particularly Indian students, coming over to Birmingham or coming to East London, they're not taking residential places offered by the universities. They're living with their relatives in Birmingham or in the East End of London. And there, they will almost certainly be being charged the full international student fee, which is probably around between 12 and 14,000 pounds.
Thanks for that comprehensive answer, Mike. We've now got Camille. Camille Candigo-Howson. Please come in.
Hi, Michael and Stephen. Thank you. That was really interesting. I was really interested in your findings about regions that you found across the UK, because I think that fits with the American. I don't really think you can call it an American system, because in reality, in America, you have 50 different models for how each state designs its higher education system and how different community colleges feed into the US system. And what you see in different states are they're designed often sort of by geographical and population centers. So you see really different models in places, but it's often based on, where people physically are, how far away HE providers are, but also vary across how HE is structured. And some states have widespread branch campuses, so then they have weaker community college systems, or vice versa. And interestingly, some are much more successful than others in developing community college systems as pathways into HE, in addition to kind of operating in themselves. And I mean, I guess that's kind of a comment, but I guess what would be interesting in the UK, I think it's too often in the UK, it's dealt with at a systematic level rather than the kind of regional approach that you mentioned, the patterns that you saw. And how could a more regionally driven system kind of maybe solve some of the UK policy problems around the integration of HE and FE?
Well, if I could just start by saying, thanks for the question. We found, a quite surprising lack of regional integration when we were looking at it. And this might be something we could address in future analysis of our data, but it was remarkable how the arrangements that the FE colleges had weren't always, or weren't characteristically with local universities. And there are programs, there's one called UniConnect, where a number of, but by no means all FE colleges are involved in a regional arrangement with their universities, but they didn't seem to set the template, if you like, for their, these commercial arrangements, these formal arrangements they enter into with the university. So, and one aspect of the regions, what FE colleges in regions, is it offers universities a way of integrating with the local community. For the reasons that Mike went into, about people being reluctant to move, particularly more disadvantaged people. But as we saw from the data, the most prestigious colleges, they don't seem to involve themselves in these arrangements at all. And while they might be involved in UniConnect, that doesn't reflect itself in the actual concrete arrangement. So we think there's a sort of pattern. There might be a sort of a replication of these formal arrangements, informal arrangements, but we didn't track those, and they're much more difficult to ever get hold of because of their informal nature. But it probably would offer a good way of integrating regions, but we found it's much more fragmentary than that in terms of the data we've actually got. I don't know if Mike wants to add anything to what I've said.
Well, just a little. You see, I think, Camilla, one has to recognize that until 1998, I think I've got the year right, higher education and further education were basically run from Whitehall. Now, you then had devolution to Wales, devolution to Scotland, devolution to North. And for the first time, what we would then call regional officials, what we would now call Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish national officials, began to think how their systems could be bettered or more adapted to their local surroundings. I mean, in other words, more like the 50 states in the US. And the research that Annika Horvath and I did, which led to the book on the governance of British higher education, showed that both in Scotland and in Wales, the region had developed an alternative way of handling higher education. And as I've said, Wales has gone down a completely different route. And this has left England looking, I think, very old-fashioned. But in this country, this is England, the belief that Whitehall knows best is actually very hard to shift. We've had some change, and there's been promises that there would be a devolution within England agenda. But that seems to be fading, partly because the metro mayors have proved to be rather effective and have stood up to the government. And so the government is not so interested in giving them more power. In fact, they'd like to take some power away, I suspect. So we're on the cusp of, do we in England move down into a devolved structure, or do we try and hang on to a centralized structure? And in a way, the jury's out on which way it will go.
I'm afraid that brings us to the end of the conversation. Thank you, Camille, for your interesting question at the end. It was great and good, and good to discuss the US system, I think, and Mike would be interested in that as well at some point in the future. I want to thank you both. I think that the YouTube version of this is going to be watched, and there's a lot in the substance of, particularly of the replies from Mike as well as from the initial presentations. So it's not a bad starting point for understanding regional questions and FE questions in the UK. Our next webinar won't occur till later in May after the CG conference. Our next event, as Trevor has been telling us all in the chat, is on Tuesday and Wednesday next week. And it's the annual Centre for Global Higher Education conference, which is just like a large webinar, really, because we're online. And it's essentially going to run for a total of 11 hours. So from 12 till 6 on Tuesday, the 11th of May, UK time, and then from 9 till 2 in the afternoon on the 12th, on Wednesday the 12th. And cast of thousands. The headline keynote will be from the World Bank's tertiary education coordinator, Roberta Bassett. And we also have Chris Millward from the Office for Students, who will talk to us about widening participation in the UK. So, and he's a major player, to be frank, and that means we've got the leading pan-national or international agency figure in Roberta Bassett from the World Bank, and we have probably the leading force, you might say, at the Office for Students and especially in the British government for widening participation and leading that policy area. And Chris's work's had a tremendous impact, I think, in a fairly short time. So those two keynotes, and then a lot of good policy discussion and national and international in the project-related sessions. The CG projects will all be on display, but instead of just doing a show and tell on the projects, we're going to run panel discussions on major issues that unite different projects. And you'll see again, Mike will be there and others that you're familiar with, such as Claire Callender and Paul Ashwin from the CG webinar series. So do register. Easy to find the access to the conference through this chat in this webinar. Also on our website, We've had several, I think it's about 500 registrations already. We've got a Zoom capacity to handle large numbers. The discussions will be taking place in plenary. We won't be splitting into small groups, but we will have breakout group further discussion after each project session. So if you like the project session or the keynote, you'll be able to continue for another 45 minutes running a Q&A and discussion with the presenters and with the panelists in a breakout. We'll also have a facility for people to create their own groups, their own discussions around their own topics at selected points during the timetable. So next Tuesday, 12 o'clock, be there for the opening of the CG annual Global Higher Education Conference. Thanks for coming today. Bye.